Welcome to the guide, Exile. Here we're going to talk about the difference between increased and reduced, and more and less modifiers, as well as how they group together, such as modifiers that are prefaced by something like enemies take. This is a topic I touch on in my beginner's guide series, but would like to explain it a bit further as there have been many additional modifiers and types added to the game, muddying and confusing the value of their other modifiers. It is still important to notice the value in taking increased modifiers along with all of the others. To start, we will go look at the basic difference between increased and reduced, and more and less modifiers. Increased and reduced modifiers are additive with one another. This means that all relevant global or local increased or reduced modifiers that you have obtained are accumulated, multiplied against any applicable more or less modifiers, and then multiplied against the desired base number to be modified. Note, recall that increased and reduced modifiers on weapons that are not listed as global only affect the innate stats of the weapon, such as physical damage, critical strike chance, and attack speed, and are directly applied to those before global modifiers are accumulated and multiplied. For example, let's say that we're using a melee one-handed axe that deals 50 physical damage on average. We get the following global increased and reduced modifiers. As we can see, all of these increases are applicable to the damage that our axe deals, as they are either directly match the type of weapon we are using, or they are generic in their application to our damage type. The same principle is applied amongst all your other damage types and sources, is that you want to get modifiers that match the tags and or types that you are dealing. So since they all match, we can add them all together. Convert the cumulative percentage to a multiplier, and then multiply it against the base damage to get the final damage. Now, more and less modifiers are multiplicative with one another. That means that all relevant more or less modifiers that you obtain are multiplied together, multiplied against the cumulative applicable increased and reduced modifiers, and then multiplied against the desired base number to be modified. So let's go back to the previous example and exchange the increased and reduced modifiers for more and less modifiers. We now have the following global more and less modifiers. Again, all of these modifiers match the desired damage that our axe deals, so let's just do some math. As these are all more and less modifiers, we do not need to add them together and directly convert them to multipliers. We then multiply them against the base damage to get the final damage. As we can see, the more and less modifiers are more impactful in their final numbers, both in improving or diminishing, and that is simply because they are multiplicative. You get what you see with these modifiers, as they will always increase or decrease your damage by the percentage listed. But with increased and reduced modifiers, you encounter diminishing returns, meaning that each additional percentage invested, you get less in return. We can see this if we return to the example of increased and reduced modifiers. At first, we start out with just 50% increased physical damage with one-handed weapons, from no prior increased modifiers. This means if we are not to get any other modifiers, this acts just like a more modifier and will give us a true 50% total increase in damage. However, when we add the next modifier, 50% increased physical damage with axes, we are going from 50% to 100% total increased damage for the same investment. For that same investment, we are only increasing our damage at this point by 33% rather than 50%. To get another 50% total damage increase from adding on the second modifier, we would need to get an increased modifier of 75% rather than 50% to offset for the additive property. You can visualize this with a simple abstract bar graph here. Imagine the bottom blue portion of the bars are the total amount of increases that we have obtained. You can see that on the left side we do not have many increased modifiers obtained, whereas on the right side we have accumulated a fair amount already. So if we are to add this smaller green bar that represents an increased modifier to each of the blue bars, you can see that the left bar will benefit far more relative to the percentage gain per investment. Knowing this information, and consequently the breakpoints of investment where it may be worth getting a different multiplier or investing in something else, is very important information to consider for developing your own builds. As such, I plan on making a more in-depth video on this topic of breakpoints, but I think this example is important to see to visualize how increased modifiers work in practice with diminishing returns. So with these modifiers differentiated and explained, let's take a look at the two sides of the table at which they can be applied. Modifiers can be placed into groups based on their wording. Now here I'm using my own terms to try and differentiate them, and it still sort of just gets complicated to see the differences clearly either way. There are common, increased, reduced, and more and less groups that are found in the passive tree, most gems, and gear. These simply read as increased, reduced, or more and less of a respective type, i.e. melee damage, damage with a weapon type, or some sort of aura effect. And these do not have any qualifying terms on them. They are accumulated based on the appropriate overlapping group types in relation to the base to be modified, and applied directly to your damage or mitigations as they read on your character sheet. This is basically what we just saw in the previous examples with the axe calculations. There are also groups of modifiers that are prefaced or surrounded by special qualifying terms such as enemies take, damage taken, or enemies deal, for example. These are examples of special modifier grouping in that they are accumulated via their specified group before being multiplied against your common modifiers. These modifications generally do not appear on your character sheet as they are done when the hit damage is calculated. One of the more popular of these is enemies take. This is a prefix that can be placed before either of the modifier types that has their application on the enemy side of taking damage and not directly to your character sheet damage output. As enemies take increased is separate from your common increases, it can be very valuable as they are starting from a fresh slate of increased modifiers. Recall the diminishing returns we talked about earlier. Here are a few of these that can be used in practice amongst many builds. Again, these are just a few of the notable enemies take modifiers that currently exist in Path of Exile, but there are many more as well being added every patch. Some are hidden within ascendancies such as the Chieftain, while others are within gear pieces such as rare Delve fossil crafted helmets. As these modifiers are not directly added or displayed on your character sheet, it is hard to tell which ones have the best value or how many to get. Luckily, Path of Building supports many of these modifiers and can make figuring out which one of these grants the most damage for their investment. Just remember that most of these are increases or reductions, meaning that they will have diminishing returns. But due to their smaller availability and their cost to incorporate them into builds, it is mostly a non-issue. And generally there is nearly an enemies take modifier that works with every build archetype, and is always worth getting at least one in your builds. You can also employ these same grouping strategies to other specific groups, as mentioned before, with damage taken or enemies deal, as these will be accumulated in the same sense that enemies take is. With that, I believe I have covered the majority of important differences between modifiers and Path of Exile. Knowing how each of these modifier types works is important to building and improving your own characters. Each modifier has its own strengths, and you will need a certain portion of each type and group in your build. However, you can never really go wrong with just stacking more multipliers. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, Exile.